It's a delight to be here. And what I told you I was going to speak about today is the functional trait evolution and community assembly in the American oaks. Wow. What I really want to talk to you about is how the oaks took over North America. And first, I need to convince you that the oaks actually did take over North America. One way we can look at this, and some of you have seen this before, is with Forest Service data from both the United States and Mexico, showing that in terms of total biomass and species richness, the oaks are tops for all woody groups in both these major countries. But another way that we can think about this and why this actually matters to you and me and to human well-being is that the oaks provide critical ecosystem services that contribute to our welfare. They were really important in our history and contributed to the United States gaining its independence from Britain. The USS Constitution, the skeleton of that ship, was made from live oaks in the southeast that Paul just talked about. And the hull of the ship was made with white oaks, Quercus alba. And some of the provisioning and regulating services that oaks provide, we can actually put a dollar value on. The wood products, the carbon that's stored in the trunks of trees and roots below ground, the fruits and nuts that trees produce, we can also put a dollar value on. And the air pollution that the leaves of trees scavenge, we can put a dollar value on. But other ecosystem services of trees are harder. It's hard to actually quantify the value of the beautiful autumn-fall color that you see. Coastal erosion protection is also trickier, or the habitat services to other organisms that oak provide. Sometimes hard to put a dollar value on. The aesthetic and cultural services, or what about the oak trees that engender a love for nature and influence the careers of young children that grow up to be oak huggers? Just point, that's me circa 1978, and that's my little baby sister, Nicole Cavender. This is our practical big sister who went on to a career in finance. And because of that influence, I've actually taken the controversial step of trying to talk about the value of oaks, not just in terms of how much we love them, we tree huggers, but also to be part of the economic conversation of how much they're actually worth. And so for 4 ecosystem services that it's actually possible to put an annual value on: carbon storage, air pollution removal, food, fruit and nuts, wood products and fiber, we can actually take a stab of looking at this in an economic context. Erosion control, hydrology, wildlife habitat, aesthetic and cultural services, and all the other ecosystem services I'm actually going to forego. So these are the 4 services that we're going to put a dollar value on. And I should say I'm not doing this alone. This is a working group at the Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center in Annapolis that I'm leading on the macroevolution of ecosystem services of trees. It's all U.S. trees, but I pulled out the oaks for you all here today. So this is part of my just convincing you why it's important that the oaks took over North America. So we can look at the annual value of carbon storage. This is based on Forest Service data. We can look at the annual value of air pollution removal. We have spatial resolution on where trees are and who they are, as well as tree crop annual revenues and wood products, oak barrels, all the things that are made from wood. And here we go. Oaks are number 1. They have the highest annual value for those 4 ecosystem services, over $15 billion annually in terms of the carbon storage, the air pollution removal, the wood products, and the crop services that they provide. more than any other tree genus in the United States. If we look at the top 25 trees in terms of their economic value for those 4 services, 6 oaks are in the top 25. Quercus alba, Quercus rubra, Quercus montana, Quercus velutina, Quercus stellata, and Quercus naira. Okay, so that was the economic piece. Now we're going to go back to the scientific and the love of oaks part of this. But what's really interesting to me is that here we have a white oak, a red oak, a white oak, a red oak, a white oak, a red oak. What is going on here? When we actually look at the biomass, the proportional biomass of the oaks in the United States, over half of the biomass is 4 species, and this is a white oak, a red oak, a white oak, a red oak, and it goes on down like this. At lower latitudes, the oaks have less biomass, but they're still alternating between clades, and then we start to pull in these other clades that Paul just talked about. So there's this interesting pattern. We can look at this spatially. These are the red oaks and the white oaks, and sorry about the missing data from North Carolina, but what's so interesting is that their distributions are largely overlapping, whereas the golden cup oaks and the live oaks, sorry, those labels are reversed. These are the live oaks and these are the gold cup oaks. That's what happens. So what I want you to take away is the overlapping distribution of the red oaks and the white oaks, the co-distribution of these major clades. So that's an observation. You all probably have noticed that before. Why is that? So I'll continue using data from the Forest Service. They've collected this in these subplots, these 200 meter square subplots within these 4,000 meter squared larger plots all across the United States. The Mexicans have done this too, but I actually don't have their data, so I'm just going to focus on the United States. And first I'll point out that if we look at the species biomass density, or how much biomass per species across a latitudinal gradient based on the Forest Service data, the northern species, the higher latitude species, have much higher biomass, a higher biomass density than the lower latitude species. And the blue circles are white oaks, the red squares are red oaks. So you see this is in both clades all along that latitudinal gradient. The oaks do follow, in the United States, a typical latitudinal gradient with increasing diversity at lower latitudes. So higher biomass density in the north. It's just 4 species that are making up most of the species up here. And as we move farther south, we get increasing density. And as Paul explained, as we keep going farther south, then you pick up all those Mexican species. We can take that Forest Service data in terms of subplots, plots, and then we can aggregate it into fractions of degrees of latitude and longitude. And we can do that for different ecoregions. So these are northern ecoregions, and these are southern ecoregions. And as we increase spatial extent, or the area, we get your standard species accumulation curves, where in southern latitudes, the more area you accumulate, the more species you get. And this is an average. If we then look at the relatedness of species, so the phylogenetic distance between them, and calculate their net relatedness, or so on this y-axis, species are more closely related to each other as we move across spatial extent or area. But what's really interesting is that we're really not getting much change. It's pretty flat all across as we increase area. We would expect that species would get less related, that we'd actually get a decrease if we were picking up new clades as we moved out in spatial extent. So if one clade were over here and one clade were over there, we would start to see a decrease here. But it's pretty flat, and that just reflects the image I showed you before of the reds and the whites and all the species within them being superimposed. They're co-distributed. So that's a phenomenon that is worth trying to understand a little bit better and helps us address this question of how the oaks took over North America. So here we have the project. Paul just talked about it. In Spanish, we call it Proyecto Encinos. And here are the Encino files. And one part of this story is that it's worth keeping in mind that some 35 million years ago, the Earth cooled pretty dramatically in this region here and caused many of the tropical taxa in North America to die off. There were many local extinctions of tropical taxa. We know that from the fossil record. Then there were all kinds of other climatic fluctuations as we reached into glacial cycles. So as taxa started to die off with global cooling, that left ecological space for colonization. And let me just explain this graph to point out the value of being deciduous when there's empty space in the temperate zone. So on the x-axis, we have the minimum temperature of the coldest month, and on this axis, we have the rainfall of the driest quarter. And I've just taken the US species and classified them in terms of whether they're evergreen, brevideciduous, or deciduous. This is the deciduous cloud, and it's basically showing if you're deciduous, you can be anywhere. If you are evergreen, you are relegated to a warm, dry place. If you're brevideciduous, you can be in dry or wet places, but you have to be in warm places. If you're deciduous, you can be anywhere. So this suggests that evolving deciduousness is a key to being able to colonize North America. And here is Andrew Hipp's poster chunked out and very roughly sketched in the deciduousness or evergreens of these different groups. And here we have the golden cup oaks and the white oaks. And what you can see is that while within clades there's often the same leaf habit, there's repeated evolution within these oaks of deciduousness. And we see that again within the red oaks. That multiple times deciduousness has evolved. It still does tend to be clustered on the phylogeny, so it didn't happen as frequently as it could have, but it repeated multiple times. It evolved multiple times in both of those major clades. So one key to the story is that the Earth cooled and deciduousness evolved, allowing species to occupy much greater climatic regions than they could if it hadn't evolved. But once they were then able to take over where the tropical taxa were dying off, what actually determined who was distributed where? What do we know about how species are distributed? When we go back to earlier ecological thinking from Robert MacArthur from 1972, when he argued that species are limited by freezing tolerance in the north and by biotic factors in the south. What are biotic factors? Well, things like disease and pests, competition, all these things that organisms have to do to defend themselves, to duke it out with their neighbors, to make a living, given that other organisms are in the same place. So we've set out to do a series of common garden studies to actually look at how different species are, how freezing tolerant they are, and what we can learn about how they might fare under biotic competition and in relation to disease. So here are the live oaks. Spent a lot of time working on the live oaks that Paul talked about. These are the 7 species and their distributions. We grew many of these in several common gardens, and here's one of them. These are all live oaks. Probably 60 families of 4 of the species. We couldn't grow Sagrina because I couldn't get the seeds out of Cuba, and we couldn't get them out of Baja California either, from the very small populations left that weren't actually producing any seeds. But for 4 species, we had about 60 families grown in 6 different rooms. We could put them in cold winters or warm winters, replicated. And from this study, we show that the minimum temperature of the coldest month very nicely predicts how vulnerable families are within species to freezing at minus 15 degrees Celsius. So when they were grown in cold winters or when they were grown in warm winters, we see that where they come from predicts very nicely how damaged they get when we freeze them at minus 15 C. And just a side note for physiology enthusiasts, this was done with the electrolyte leakage method. The idea is that when living cells form crystals inside, freeze inside, that bursts the cell and kills the cell. And the bursting of the cell causes it to dump its contents. When we put it in solution, we can then measure the conductivity of that solution. So that's what we do. We take pieces of stem, we freeze it at different temperatures, and then we measure the conductivity relative to a reference to evaluate the vulnerability to freezing. So MacArthur hypothesized that there would be a trade-off between freezing tolerance and growth rate, and this might be something that would influence species distributions. So that if the species that have high freezing tolerance invest in that freezing tolerance and at the expense of being able to grow fast, then they might do better in the north, but not be able to compete in the south. And likewise, the ones that invest in fast growth, but not in freezing tolerance, can fare well, can duke it out in the south with their competitors, but they don't have the freezing tolerance to make it in the north. And that's what we actually see. We see a trade-off between freezing tolerance and growth rate in these live oaks. So then we set out to do this again beyond the live oaks with 30 species across the major lineages. Again, warm and cold winters replicated 3 times each, and here are some of those plants. And thanks to the people who collected seeds amongst you, many other people too. For this first experiment, here are the seed sources of all of those species. And we used the same method, but we froze stems at a suite of different temperatures. And for these southern species, you can see a pretty steep slope as you make it colder, as you freeze at colder and colder temperatures, the injury increases pretty rapidly. And that looks quite different from these northern species that are pretty freezing tolerant. As you freeze them at colder and colder temperatures, they get a little more injured, but not that much. They can take it at these very cold temperatures. And when we look at this across the phylogeny, for all of these species, shown here are, these are the species in blue that are pretty freezing tolerant, and the red and the orange ones are really hammered by cold temperatures, and the green ones are intermediate. And so, you know, while you see that there are some clades that are pretty cold tolerant, pretty freezing tolerant, and others that are sort of intermediate, there is a fair amount of back and forth. So there is a lot of lability in the evolution of freezing tolerance, which means that it isn't just what your ancestor was. These species actually evolved with a half-life of, we estimated, of about 3 million years, so that they are able to erode the ancestral state, half the ancestral state in about 3 million years, which is not super fast, but it also means that there was time for species to adapt to the climate in the context of the colonization of North America. We can look at this again in terms of the minimum temperature of the coldest month, and again we find that it very strongly predicts injury from freezing at minus 15 degrees. We can do this both with a straight correlation or fit it to an evolutionary model where we see how fast species adapted to an optimum. And then we can also look at the ability of species to acclimate to cold and increase their freezing tolerance. And it turns out that species from cold places when you put them in a warm winter, they're not very freezing tolerant, but when you put them in a cold winter, they are able to acclimate, become cold hardy, and have very high freezing resistance. Whereas when you take a warm species from warm places and do the same thing, they are not able to gain cold tolerance. So we can then define acclimation ability and see that species from warm places don't have the ability to acclimate, whereas species from cold places do. So we definitely see adaptation to climate within these American oaks. And we tried also looking at growth rate, as in the Varentes, to see if that traded off with freezing tolerance, but it turns out that it doesn't. Growth rates are really variable and are more associated with habit. Are they shrubs? Are they trees? Do they grow in fire-prone places, rich soils, poor soils, and so forth? So growth does not trade off with freezing tolerance when we move out to the larger set of species. But what is really interesting, something I started noticing in the greenhouses, is that the cold-tolerant species were starting to accumulate all kinds of pathogens. So we finally decided to start measuring these, and it's really interesting to me that the pathogen load for things like powdery mildew and leaf scorch and necrosis of the leaves trades off with the vulnerability to freezing. So those species that are more cold tolerant at this end, they have a higher pathogen load. So that you can either be freezing tolerant and you then pretty much ditch your leaves and you don't have to sustain a pathogen load, or you are very cold tolerant and those leaves need to be able to persist for a longer period of time and be resistant to pathogens. So there's a clear trade-off there, and this again goes along with the MacArthur hypothesis that species are limited at the north by cold stress, but by biotic interactions at the south. And so this trade-off, again, may explain species distributions. So here showing the trade-off, I think I labeled this wrong, but so there's a trade-off between freezing tolerance and pathogen load. So I've showed you a little bit now about how species distributions within the temperate zone are related to adaptation to those climates. And what about drought stress and things that vary within a given temperature region? So here's a study again on the live oaks. This is a former postdoc, Jose Ramirez Valiente, and he did a nice study on the live oaks, which I'm not going to explain, but you can read about, that basically shows that the climatic origins, including the precipitation, predicts the responses of species to drought stress. And then Matt, who will be talking next, and I won't say too much about his work, but he's done a really elegant study looking at many oak species and putting them under drought conditions to try to understand whether there are differences among species in their drought tolerance and what that looks like. I'll just show you one little thing, and that is when we look at the stomates on the underside of the leaves, and we look at their pore area and their density, we see that the stomatal pore area increases with species that are growing in wetter areas. So we again see adaptations to the local conditions influencing how species might be distributed. Then I spent my sabbatical with Tonio in Mexico collecting many specimens, and our whole group has done quite a lot of collecting that gives us a suite of material, of specimens that we can actually measure traits on. And here's just one bit. So just looking at the leaf size and shape of all these different species that our group collected, Matt then took those specimens, and one thing he measured was leaf area. And you might expect that leaf area, larger leaves do better in wet places, smaller leaves are better for dry places, smaller leaves have a higher boundary layer resistance, they lose less water, they tend to have thicker leaves. So it's not too surprising to see that relationship. But we get a tighter relationship when we look at the leaf perimeter to area, and we see that that relationship drops in wetter places. What's going on there? Well, there's two ways to have a high leaf perimeter to area. One is to be very bisected, and this allows rapid cooling and prevents water loss. Or you can be small and also have a high perimeter to area ratio, because you have a small value in the denominator. And so small leaves tend to do better in drier places, less evaporative demand, less wilting and so forth. Whereas these larger leaves that tend to be less lobed do better in wet places. So just from this simple analysis of leaf size and shape, we see really clear patterns with soil moisture. So we know that there are clear physiological and morphological traits in oaks that influence the way they're distributed across environmental gradients, that influence the way they interact with other organisms, and allow them to be better suited to places where there's a lot of other species and pathogens and pests and so forth. So here is the way it looks like things have happened with the oaks, that they arrived, as Paul showed you, the biogeographic history. Some of them evolved deciduousness, allowing them to occupy any part of North America. And then when they got into those climates, they then radiated to fill all the possible kinds of habitats that were available to them. And this was possible because the tropical taxa had gone locally extinct and there was empty space for oaks to be able to do this. And so we think that both major clades adapted to a range of climates, and then within those, the oaks partitioned habitats within each climate, especially at the lower latitudes where there are many species together. Drought tolerance was one of those mechanisms. And it also looks like differential susceptibility to pests, and I think Ian Pierce may talk more about this, allows the reds and the whites to co-occur together. The white oaks form tyloses, they have narrow vessels, they're susceptible to different kinds of fungal pathogens than the red oaks that don't form tyloses and have larger vessels, which may allow these reds and whites to pack more tightly together without density-dependent mortality. So by having parallel adaptive radiation, the oaks may have been able to pack more species together than they would have been otherwise. And so finally, this is a plot from John McVeigh, who's not here, showing the speciation rate on the y-axis and the time before present on the x-axis. And it looks like as we had this global cooling 35 million years ago, and the tropical taxa started to die off, we got a rapid increase in the speciation rate. And then there was radiation into all those ecological habitats. Speciation started to decline. And in the southeastern US, we actually got a big decline in the speciation rate. Of course, this depends on the sampling that we have in hand. We're missing many of the Mexican taxa. Here's some wild speculation of if we actually had all the Mexican taxa, perhaps we wouldn't see this big decline in speciation. With the rise of the transverse volcanic belt in Mexico 15 million years ago, we might have seen sustained speciation down there. So, in short, deciduousness allowed rapid oak colonization and speciation in the temperate zone. Once the temperate zone was filled, speciation slowed, and that's how the oaks took over the Americas.